we're going to kind of talk through why and how investors are betting on generative AI, because we've seen some research recently by McKinsey that estimates that generative AI as a category could add the equivalent of $2.6 to $4.4 trillion of annual value alone to the global economy. And they actually estimate that about 75% of that value will accrue through four use cases, which they categorize as customer operations, marketing and sales, software engineering, and R&D. They also detail the impact will be felt across all industries and sectors, but specifically point out that banking, high tech, and life sciences could see a huge impact. Now, this full research report is far beyond the purview of this discussion. Maybe we can cover it in depth another time. It's well worth a read. But the larger point here is that this possible market impact of generative AI is simply massive. And we've seen in the past week or two, investors are clearly responding to that because they've just written a couple of huge checks to leading generative AI companies. Now, first up, Inflection AI, who we've talked about quite a bit, announced it raised $1.3 billion in a fresh fundraising round that was led by Microsoft, Reid Hoffman, who started LinkedIn, Bill Gates, and NVIDIA. And what's crazy is Inflection AI has been around just over a year. And in that time, they've built one of the world's most sophisticated large language models. And this model powers Pi, their personal AI assistant product. The company is also building the, quote, largest AI cluster in the world, comprising 22,000 NVIDIA H100 Tensor Core GPUs. It's also important to note that Inflection AI CEO and co-founder, Mustafa Suleyman, also co-founded DeepMind, which was acquired by Google back in 2014 and forms the backbone of that company's AI projects. Now, at the same time, I think it was on the exact same day, Runway, which is a suite of generative AI tools for creators, announced a $141 million extension to its Series C funding round. And that was participated in by companies like Google, NVIDIA, Salesforce Ventures, and other huge investors. Now, I wanted to start off here, Paul, by connecting some dots. Like, why are investors writing such enormous checks for generative AI companies, especially as the overall startup funding environment seems to be slowing down a little bit?
Well, these are the companies building the foundational models, for one. So, we've talked about in the generative AI tech stack, you have the kind of infrastructure companies, like the cloud and the chip companies like NVIDIA, and then Google, AWS, Microsoft. And then you have kind of the model companies that are building the foundational models that then you can build application or software on top of. So these investments, like Runway is building their own models. Inflection is certainly building a massive foundational model. They also announced last week that they're within a few months will have the second largest supercomputer in the world. So they're raising all this money because they are investing massively in the infrastructure, in the chips, the GPUs, so they can have this this massive cluster of these GPUs to do this stuff, to train these models, and it takes a lot of money. So I think the reason you're seeing massive checks is a lot of this money ends up going back to NVIDIA to buy GPUs. So to build and train these massive models, Cohere, they just raised what it was, 100 and some million, at a couple $1 billion valuation. So that's why it takes a lot of money to build these foundational models to train them. So that's why we're seeing it there. And then in the application layer, you've seen less, at least we're not hearing about it as much at the kind of the SaaS model layer, because it's really hard to know who to make a bet on. So right now it seems like a lot of money is funneling into these like 5 or 6 foundation model companies that appear to be the best bets moving forward to be, built on top of. Inflection in particular is quite interesting. We talked about it recently on the podcast a few times. I've been testing Pi. It's designed to be more personal and empathetic and conversational. So if you haven't explored it yet, you can go test it out for free. It asks a lot of questions. Like when you ask it to do something rather than just outputting something like ChatGPT would, like write me an essay on this, and then GPT just writes it. The Inflection will say, tell me more about the audience you're writing for, or what are the goals of the piece? So it's designed to kind of be more kind of conversational, I guess, and iterative. The one other thing that caught my attention yesterday was, so Mustafa Suleyman was not active on Twitter for a pretty long time. It was very, periodically. Um, which, by the way, we don't have threads in the conversation this week. We should probably have a word or two about threads at the end of this. But
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, so Twitter, which is still my primary vehicle for learning things and keeping up on AI space, he tweeted yesterday, soon LLMs will know when they don't know. They'll know when to say, I don't know, or instead ask another AI or ask a human or use a different tool or a different knowledge base. This will be a hugely transformative moment. So this is kind of a little, I guess, side conversation here, but um, one of the big issues we've talked about with LLMs is they make stuff up. They hallucinate and you can't trust them. They'll make up citations, they'll make up facts, places, people, whatever. One of the key areas of pursuit right now within the research labs is how do we solve this? How do we solve hallucination? We've talked about Sundar Pichai on the 60 Minutes episode back in like March or April said, like, we're making progress, but we don't know. So the general consensus up until now is like, they don't really know how to solve it. But here we have Inflection raising 1.3 billion, and I believe they're actively raising more now. I think they plan to raise like 10 billion plus. You have the CEO and the founder saying, this is something we think is solvable. And oftentimes what happens is like a Sam Altman or Mustafa, they're tweeting something that they're actively working on and that they feel like they've made significant progress on to the point where they're going to publicly say, this is solvable. So one of the challenges of large language models, especially in corporations, for marketers, for brands, for businesses, is this unreliability issue. And so now you have a company that just raised 1.3 billion with a CEO saying, hey, I think we can solve this. And so I would just, again, like, you just never know when the state of this stuff is going to flip. And if we can get to a point where this kind of funding is able to them to build the kind of models that actually solve for hallucination in whatever path they choose to do it, it's a really big deal. And that's why, like, when somebody raises kind of money, like I put on LinkedIn, like, hey, if you're not following Inflection, like, you got to follow them.
Yeah.
This is where the innovation comes from, and you got to pay attention to what they're saying.
So if I'm a marketer or a business leader looking at generative AI tools, models, I mean, how should I be thinking about making my own bets? Not necessarily from an investment perspective, but from where to allocate time and budget to generative AI companies and platforms, given how fiercely competitive this space is.
Yeah, it's tricky. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Like, what is the buying process for an LLM or for the applications? And I don't know that it's defined yet. I don't know that there's a correct way to do this, because you can, like, what I'll tell organizations, like there's a big enterprise we've been talking to lately, kind of doing some consulting work for. And I said, okay, like, you're a Microsoft shop, start with Microsoft. Like, you start with the core tech stack, because if you're in a big enterprise, you're talking about massive procurement. You got to get through IT, you got to get through security, you got to get through all these issues, regulatory, if you're, in a highly regulated industry. So your best bet is going to be, if you have AWS, Google, or Microsoft, there's a really good chance you're working with one of those companies. And if you're a big enterprise, you have a relationship with them, a high up relationship, start there. And then you're going to go out and look at, like, okay, what are the other language models we should be talking to? What are the application layer companies we should be talking to? And I think what's going to happen is you're going to have, like, let's say you take a big enterprise, like a financial services company. There's a chance that the marketing team is going to just move forward with a Jasper or a Writer or something at that application layer, just so they can get started, because there's obvious use cases and these are solutions built for the enterprise for those specific use cases. And so then you're going to have the enterprise overall that's going to be looking at long-term, what's our play with language model or language models, and how do we build them into the organization? But that's going to take a long time. Whereas you can, like, jump in and start using an application company, a SaaS company, tomorrow for marketing. So I think there's going to be this mix of near term, let's just go get an application layer company. And then mid to long term, let's start talking to these foundation model companies and seeing if we can build our own, or go get an open source model like a Falcon 40 or Llama, whatever, and like build our own language models internally. It's just, I haven't seen anybody who's solved for this yet, but a lot of people are asking us these questions.